It's a real privilege to be here with CSREA in the book series, and a great privilege to introduce Dr. Bailey. Yelena Bailey, who's presenting today, is a writer and researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of policy, power, cultural production, and racial belonging in the United States. She received her doctorate from the University of California, San Diego, where her research focused on the relationship between Black women's literary production and their participation in Black internationalist movements. As an assistant professor of English and Cultural Studies in Seattle, Dr. Bailey completed her work, How the Streets Were Made, which the presentation will come from today. She's the recipient of the Popular Culture Studies Association's John G. Cowelty Award for Best Textbook, and was selected as a finalist for the 2021 Minnesota Book Award. Dr. Bailey is bilingual in English and Spanish, and has taught Chicanx literature, among many other subjects, including a course now she teaches to the New York City College of Technology called Blackness, Space, and Belonging. As Stephanie mentioned, currently Dr. Bailey works as the Director of Education Policy at the State of Minnesota's Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board. I want to remind you that we are welcoming questions throughout the presentation and in the Q&A period after Dr. Bailey's talk. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Bailey. Thank you.
Thank you both for that wonderful introduction. I am so thrilled to be here with you all, and very much looking forward to talking through some key ideas from my book project, as well as digging into some good Q&A towards the end. I'd actually like to start by reading a quote from the August 1965 issue of Ebony magazine. And I want to start with this because it really frames the purpose and the framework of my book project, which I'll dig into in just a moment, as well as because Ebony magazine becomes the kind of primary medium through which I examine the development of Black consumerism in relationship to kind of geographic and housing segregation. And I'll spend some time showing some images and talking a little bit about that, which comes from the second chapter. But this is from an essay in an issue that was devoted to what they called the white problem in America. So an issue that was attempting to dig into issues of racial discrimination and disparities, 60 years ago. But it really frames this idea of the streets. So it reads, today our big cities are in decline not only because they are aging, but because their source of taxing, the very base which provides for their upkeep, is being eroded by the corrosive sublimate of the white man's hatred and the white man's fear. The white man creates the ghettos and brutalizes and exploits the people who inhabit them, and then he fears them, and then he flees from them. He builds Harlem, and then he runs from Harlem. He created second-class schools, and then he fears for his children, lest they be compelled to attend them. He creates a climate of despair, and then acts surprised when the protest march fill the streets and the riots erupt. So, again, this essay is from 60 years ago, but in many ways, it could be published just today or in the wake of, the summer of 2020. And it frames kind of the heart of this project for me, which is understanding the streets as not just the product of housing policy and these fixed, physical geographic spaces, but understanding the streets, or, what they call the ghetto, others might call the hood, as a sociocultural construct that shapes Black life in very tangible ways, economically, socially, as well as something that situates Blackness in relationship to kind of the wider American imaginary. Before I dig into kind of, those ideas a bit more and how I see that through that history of housing segregation, I want to ground this work for me, and this maybe lets you a little bit know my analytical framework in approaching things. But for me, I have to ground this work in kind of, concrete material circumstances. And this is a project that was very personal for me, both in terms of experience and intellectually. It's something I had really been thinking through, for 10 years or so, as I would analyze things I saw in hip hop and on television, but I didn't have the time or, the analytical framework to do the interdisciplinary work to really dig into it until just, a few years ago. So that's something that, is important to me is pulling together these interdisciplinary threads to really understand the complexity of the streets. But also, it's something that, is personal to me, obviously as a Black person living in this country, but even more so as kind of locally my experience living in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. So many of you will have heard of Minneapolis, unfortunately, because we, been in the news recently with things like the murder of Amir Locke, Daunte Wright, George Floyd, Philando Castile. It seems like every few years, there we are again. And those are events that have drawn, national and global attention. But for someone who has grown up in this area, they make a certain kind of, sense, quote unquote, in the logic of the space of this metro area. And I say metro, Minneapolis and St. Paul are the twin cities, and it's like one connected metro area. We're small in the Midwest. It's where I grew up. It's where I'm currently living. And it shaped my understanding of Black space in very specific ways. One of those is, as I was growing up, if I told people my mom is from North Minneapolis, that invoked a very particular set of meaning and understanding. If you're not from Minnesota, that won't mean anything to you, but it nationally would be the same thing as if I said to you, oh, this person grew up on the south side of Chicago, right? Or in the Cabrini Green area. And this idea that the naming of specific spaces has all this associated kind of racialized nature and meanings is what got me to really digging into what the streets are. And why is it that when I say North Minneapolis, everybody has this shared understanding of what that means and what that signifies. It's also, I think, interesting to me as, someone who grew up with a life that was shaped by the streets, even though I didn't grow up in North Minneapolis. I talked about this a little bit in the introduction, but I wrestled kind of, intellectually with what are the streets as an entity and how do they shape Blackness, not just in those physical spaces, but for anyone who happens to be racialized as Black, right? And so the example I came up with is, in my own life, in order to not have the lack of kind of resources that, my mom had growing up and to have access to those first ring suburb, middle class schools, we would move every year, right? And that is not, to say like, look how my mom managed to overcome, the streets, but more to show that even in their absence, right, the nature of the streets and what they signify in very concrete material ways is shaping Black lives, right, including my own. It's also something I think about, in the wider landscape of this country when, I think about my own hometown or Twin Cities, the interesting kind of juxtaposition of narrative. So the Twin Cities is voted consistently in like the top 5 areas to live in. And that's even the slogan of St. Paul is like best place to live or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording, but we also are voted the 2nd worst metro area in the nation for Black people. And that's largely down to the fact that even though we're small and people don't tend to think of Minneapolis, you think of Chicago and LA, we are one of the most physically segregated, as well as one of the highest rates of racial economic disparities. And so a lot of that informed my work because, people are noticing some of these things when it makes national news for, George Floyd's murder. I have been observing my whole life the way that these very material conditions and the product of the history of racial and geographic segregation continues to shape kind of the way Blackness is understood, both within those physical spaces and outside of them. So that's, I think a large part, kind of the driving force behind this book. The other kind of big picture thing that I'll dig into is this concept of how homeownership becomes kind of the contemporary stand-in for how, particularly white Americans, but how the nation understands itself or frames itself. So it becomes, the central way or metaphor for the kind of US national project. And so I was interested in understanding that more, as well as then where the streets sit and Blackness sits in relationship to that. So I'll spend some time digging into that today. Of course, in this book, I do spend time in that first chapter digging quite a bit into like the history of geographic segregation, housing segregation itself. And I won't recap that necessarily here because I tend to find that, in more kind of academic spaces, that's a familiar history, right? We have, great works, Nancy and Denton's American Apartheid, which is well known. Even, just for popularity's sake, Rothstein's The Color of Law a couple of years ago. The PBS special that came out maybe 20 years ago, it's a somewhat known history in that regard in terms of the role of the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and some of those policies. And even outside of that, if you're familiar with, Keeanga-Yamada Taylor's Race for Profit. So there's been really great work done by scholars on kind of that history and the economic impact. But I dig into it in the book for a couple of reasons. One is because I really wanted this to be not only an interdisciplinary work, but something that was accessible and ideally widely read by people in and outside of academic spaces. And, I've been lucky enough that most of the talks that I end up giving are, libraries and nonprofits across the country where people are, digging into this that may not necessarily dig into the issue otherwise. And to me, that was important because as I did my research, I find more and more that this is a really under-reflected upon issue. I would say, broadly speaking, particularly outside of the academy. A good example of this, and something I mentioned in either the intro or chapter 1, is that there was that Yale psych study that was done looking at kind of white Americans' perception of the racial wealth gap. And it found that on average, white Americans assumed that Black Americans had about 80% of the wealth that they did, when in reality, it's about 5%, depending on your source, 5 to 9%. But so that gap in understanding and the fact that economists have largely traced that economic disparity to the history of housing segregation, the wealth that was created through it, and what that was used for, investments and businesses and inheritances, shows me that even if we just peel this back to kind of economic terms, there's still a gross kind of underestimation of the importance of this history. So I do spend some time digging into that in the first chapter. Happy to answer questions or dig into that if anyone's interested, but I also don't want to re-go over anything that you all may be very familiar with. I will say what I did attempt to do in that first chapter is add a different layer or lens or angle to this by focusing, again, not just on the economic impact or the history, but how through those policies and the physical traits that were being assigned to that space, as well as the zoning laws, how that then contributed to, again, this social construct of the streets, right? Or this cultural construct of the streets. So, some good examples of that are at the primary moment where you have, the New Deal policies that are making homeownership widely accessible financially to white Americans, and they're moving into the suburbs, and you have the kind of creation of the, a modern white American middle class. You also have new access, new wider access to public housing for Black Americans. Historically, Black Americans had a very hard time accessing public housing. And when it was opened up, again, they were maintained as segregated spaces. But what happens in this shift is that as Black Americans are given access to that public housing, the housing itself changes. So it goes from more single family homes to the creation of these large, towering high-rises and this dense housing, which again becomes synonymous then. Now, when it conjures up images of the hood or the ghetto or the streets, right? These are the images we see because that's what these policies created that space to be synonymous with poverty and with denseness, right? I think of just a fact about The Wire, if you're familiar with the television show, is that they actually use CGI to put in some of these project towers that had been torn down before the show was recorded, because that's the image that people would expect to see when they think of those Black spaces. So, it's interesting to think again how these policies didn't just create these economic and social issues, but also, again, the construct of how we think of Black space itself. Other examples are things, like the industrial zoning, the permitting of more bars and liquor stores, the failure to police sex work, which of course nowadays we would say is not a bad thing, right? But at the time, these were intentional moves to make those spaces synonymous with a sort of moral deficiency or moral inferiority, which is important when we turn in a few minutes, which we will, to how homeownership, in particular the way it's envisioned in kind of white suburbia, becomes a way to think about like the moral grounding of the nation, right? So then when you get into particularly the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s with Reaganism and the war on drugs and the kind of law and order, that the streets then and Black urban spaces are seen as a threat to that, the way that these moral, family-oriented white spaces exist as the center of national identity. So some of those policies and how they contribute to these larger cultural ideologies and conversations are what I dig into a little bit in that first chapter. And then the last thing I'll mention as an interesting, I guess, example, that they don't just shape how people exist within those physical spaces, right, of these urban cities, but also how Black people were made to live or be when they attempted to leave them. So really, I think a great or interesting kind of example of this is in Carolyn Finney has a book called Black Faces, White Spaces that talks about some of the sundown towns and records a story of a middle-class Black family that is, wants to explore the country and travel, but can't because they, and the way that they have been racialized to exist in particular spaces means that they are not welcome after dark in those rural areas, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge the way that the construct of the streets and who belongs in which spaces and how they exist in those spaces is enforced in very tangible, sometimes violent ways. So all of this is kind of in the first chapter. And again, just framing the kind of theoretical interest that I have in this idea of the streets. And so I really have kind of three takeaways, I guess, that I would share. One is that I'm really interested in how homeownership itself, again, is tied to the national project of kind of US capitalism, and how the history of housing segregation and the streets are then situated in relationship to that. The second is to think about how that project of homeownership and national identity has shaped and continues to shape broader power structures and cultural ideologies. And the last thing that I'm really interested in the book that I'll talk a bit about here in terms of Ebony magazine, but happy to talk about some of the other areas that I look at in the book, is how Black people, authors, writers, creatives have responded and challenged this kind of national project of imagining through space who belongs where, through their writing, through their music, through film. And in that, I really draw from George Lipsitz and Catherine McKittrick's work, this idea of carving out discursive spaces and creating new imaginative geographies. And I found that a lot of Black artists and authors and creatives use that cultural geography to challenge the way that they're being fixed in these very physical, tangible ways, right? However, sometimes those discursive spaces have their own set of negative implications. And that's something I'll talk about in the case of Ebony magazine in particular. So what I'd like to do now is just spend a little bit of time talking about the role of homeownership itself. So I think to understand the streets, to understand the construct of the streets and how they situate Blackness within the kind of wider American imaginary, we have to understand the significance of homeownership, right? This isn't just a matter of who gets to own what or live where, but it's about who belongs and how they belong. So I'm going to share an image just because it, one, shows you a redlining map of my own city, but two, it has a quick quote on here. And I'm going to read for you an excerpt from a speech that President Herbert Hoover gave in 1931 to the White House Conference on Home Building and Homeownership. And this is really where you can see the way the government is using the desire and the idea of homeownership to tie it to a new understanding of what it means to be and belong in this nation. So I'll share my screen and then I'll read this excerpt for you. All right, so this is what he shares with the White House Conference on Homeownership. I am confident that the sentiment for homeownership is so embedded in the American heart that millions of people who dwell in tenements, apartments, and rented rows of solid brick have the aspiration for wider opportunity and ownership of their own homes. To possess one's own home is the hope and ambition of almost every individual in our country, whether he lives in hotel, apartment, or tenement, impelled by the high ideal and aspiration that each family may pass their days in the home which they own, that they may nurture it as theirs, that it may be their castle in all that exquisite sentiment which surrounds the sweetness of family life. This aspiration penetrates the heart of our national well-being. It makes for happier married life. It makes for better children. It makes for confidence and security. It makes for courage to meet the battle of life. It makes for better citizenship. There can be no fear for a democracy or self-government or for liberty or freedom from homeowners, no matter how humble they may be. I'm going to continue, and you're going to hear, see where this next quote comes from. But already, I hope you're noticing the language here of national well-being and of family life. And I'll explain in a moment kind of how these become the key terms through which homeownership is framed. But he continues and he takes kind of this patriotic, framing of homeownership, and he racializes it very specifically in this next part. There is a wide distinction between homes and mere housing. Those immortal ballads, Home Sweet Home, My Old Kentucky Home, and Little Gray Home on the West, were not written about tenements or apartments. They are the expressions of racial longing, which find outlet in the living poetry and songs of our people. They were written about an individual abode, alive with the tender associations of childhood, the family life at the fireside, the free outdoors, the independence, the security, and the pride and possession of the family's own home, the very seat of its being. That our people should live in their own homes is a sentiment deep in the heart of our race and of American life. So there's a lot in this speech. One could possibly interpret this as a broad conversation of, the human race, but any kind of reasonable close reading shows that that's not the case, right? One is he's framing homeownership as distinctly American, but then he narrows that. And the references here, the allusions to these songs, are important because what they do is they connect homeownership as the natural evolution of the settler colonial project. So invoking these, he is making the case that where the original project was to expand westward and pursue the ownership of land and to conquer it, that now to be an American is to do that through the ownership of one's home, and that's the way one is invested in the nation. So it's interesting to think how homeownership then becomes this stand-in or the kind of next stage of US capitalism, that instead of conquering the land, right, or colonizing it, now it's up to the citizen to stake their claim and their investment in this national project. Of course, this is tying it to, the ideologies of manifest destiny and very much placing this and the participation of this within a stringent kind of idea of racial hierarchy. But it's fascinating to think how homeownership itself becomes a stand-in. I think this is something that isn't explored enough, I think, is this idea of how homeownership fits within a wider understanding of kind of the settler colonial project in the US. This speech in 1931 is really the culmination of a decades-long project to frame homeownership as a quintessential part of US identity. And I'll talk a little bit about how we got here, but I do want to note that, this moment that Hoover's giving this speech is important because in the decades that, preceded it, he, along with others, did a lot of work to lay this foundation so that, white Americans across the country would be invested in this. And then in the couple of years that follow, you get the New Deal and you get the policies that make it financially feasible for people to enact these ideologies and to own their home and to move to the suburbs and to manifest this dream. So it's interesting to think about this moment as kind of that tipping point, right? It's also the moment where the race that he invokes and the policies that allow people to buy their homes widens that scope of what whiteness itself is, where you have different white ethnic groups through their purchasing of their homes and they're moving to these suburbs and integrating with other, with Anglo-Saxon groups, are able to then widen this understanding of whiteness itself and of who belongs in the nation. The other thing I'll mention, this is very much a question of a project that is attentive to class and class solidarity. So the attempt here to create the white middle class is to break up also integrated class solidarity. And you see that in kind of very intentional designing in cities like Atlanta or Oakland, where you have the clearing out of integrated working class neighborhoods, particularly among Southern and Eastern Europeans and Black Americans who were working in factories, living in the same communities, and the city designs and the segregation breaks that up, and then they're moved into the suburbs with other white middle class Americans. So it's interesting to think about the class implications of this as well. I mention that because as I step back, I want to share with you, again, those decades that led up to that 1931 speech. And it starts in 1917 with, of course, hopefully you're thinking of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? That causes a panic and the necessity to reinforce US capitalism. And so how that plays out in terms of housing is the US Department of Labor takes over a campaign that had originally been started by the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And that was the Own Your Own Home campaign. And I'll show you some images in a moment. But that's kind of the starting point. And then in 1921, Herbert Hoover, who was then the Secretary of Commerce, starts the Better Homes in America movement. And this included leadership like Vice President Calvin Coolidge, FDR, who was then the one to make it financially possible later to actually enact these beliefs. And at the time, FDR was the president of the American Construction Council. And I mention this because you can hopefully see the interplay here between, the real estate boards, the construction council, these government officials, that this was a project, a coordinated project across public and private sectors to frame, again, national identity and investment in US capitalism through the lens of homeownership. So the Better Homes in America movement used similar images to the ones that I'll show you in just a moment. And they focused on putting them in magazines or pamphlets. So you would have them targeted magazines like The Delineator, primarily focusing on, magazines aimed at white women homemakers. But the Own Your Own Home campaign took this a step further. I'm going to share an image here that I'll talk about. But this is the first image from that campaign. And the Own Your Own Home campaign published in these magazines, but it also, they put up posters in everywhere from factories to offices, again, across class, focusing on creating a new kind of solidified white middle class identity, pulling people from everywhere from factories to offices. They handed out buttons to school children. They published in these magazines. They had pamphlets. So it was a widespread campaign. So when I say that it took those decades to lay this ideological foundation of what home ownership meant in terms of the broad American imaginary and how the citizen, who is defined clearly kind of in this ad, sees himself, you can really begin to understand the different ways that was performed. So this is from the Own Your Own Home campaign. And of course, you have the image here of the man who owns his home is a better worker, husband, father, and a real American. And I love these because, I love history because you don't have to do much to embellish. It's just there. But the emphasis here, as you see, you heard kind of Hoover talk about, is a very narrow understanding of home life is a center of kind of the white heteronuclear family, right? But it's interesting to think that here, that ownership is tied to one's ability. If you can look over on the right-hand side here, it talks about pride and success, and your family looks to you to give them a home. So it's tied not only to kind of his identity as, the husband and the father, but in his ability to be productive as a worker and then use his wages to invest in the nation by providing for his family. So it's an interesting thing to think about, not just the kind of racial and kind of gendered nature of homeownership here, but also this question of productivity and its relationship to, the project of US capitalism here. The next image I want to show you is, and this is the last one I'll show you from the Own Your Own Home campaign. I'm going to put 2 images in the book because it's expensive to put images in books. But this is one that was aimed towards the white female women homemakers, right? So this is a little bit different in the language, right? So, how glad I am that I agreed with John when he proposed it. And then it talks a little bit, if you look through here, it frames it very much through the lens of financial responsibility. It talks about it being a wise choice. And then about decorating, creating a home atmosphere is kind of language you'll hear quite frequently used. And so this is something that hopefully will stay in your mind when I talk about advertisements in a moment, because this image of the, kind of white domestic life at the center of the home and home ownership becomes the image and the imagery that you see in the creation of this new kind of consumer market that's tied to home ownership. Happy to come back to this if people have questions and want to dig into that a little bit more. But it gives you, again, a sense of what's happening here over those decades to build up this idea that by the time you get to Hoover's speech, and then a few years later to the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration and the subsidized loans that make homeownership not only more widely possible, right, through longer terms and lower down payments, but also something that financially benefits those by building equity, is that choice isn't just, even though it's framed through this lens of kind of personal choice and what's good for the family, but it's a choice of one's devotion and belonging in the nation. So it frames that participation in those programs in a very different light. The last thing I want to show you as I talk about kind of just how significant homeownership is in kind of a modern understanding of, US nationalism and US capitalism, is that decades later, when you get to, the Cold War, this becomes the way that kind of US success and the promise of capitalism is framed. So you all may be familiar with this already, but one of my kind of favorite entertaining moments from history is the kitchen debate. And so if you're unfamiliar, what it was is a cultural exchange. I won't say much about that, but the USSR had a display that they put on, I believe it was New York, and kind of like all the best things about, Soviet Russia. And then you have the US who had their display in Moscow of all the best things of US capitalism, right? So this is in Moscow in 1959, and this is Nixon and Khrushchev. And of course, one of the key ways to show how, successful and promising US capitalism is through a model home. So our display of what's the greatest things about our nation includes this model home. And I'm going to show you, or I'm going to read to you a quote of what Nixon is saying as he's talking to Khrushchev. So he goes, "This is our newest model. This is the kind which is built in thousands of units for direct installations in the houses. In America, we like to make life easier for women." And then Khrushchev, who famously likes to interrupt Nixon, digs into him about his sexism and questions kind of how long the houses last and if people really can, access and afford them. And Nixon goes on to say, "American houses last for more than 20 years. But even so, after 20 years, many Americans want a new house or a new kitchen. The kitchen is obsolete by that time. The American system is designed to take advantage of new inventions and new techniques." And this is interesting because it frames homeownership not only as central to American identity, right, but it frames the consumerism tied to that home as equally important and relevant, right? So to be a model citizen and participant in the nation is not only to own your home, but to own all the newest, latest, and greatest products and to consume all of the things that are associated with home ownership. And that leads me to the last kind of, big piece of key theme or item I want to share with you, which is how I decided, or I wanted to dig into this question then of, if homeownership drives and creates this new market associated with it, and this new understanding of the, modern white American consumer, then what does the construct of the streets do? And what does that mean for how Black people are understood through the lens of consumerism? So for context about that market, there's a book called Soap, Sex, and Cigarettes that I actually think does a good overview of some of that and talks about the fact that, again, this is a brand new market that was booming and created things that we're familiar with today, like Tide heavy duty detergent, Cascade. But, white American homeowners are buying refrigerators and freezers and all of these things tied to home ownership in unprecedented numbers. So you have this, when I say it was a brand new market that became the center of a lot of consumerism, I'm not, overstating that. And a couple of images to show you that. I wanted to show you these from Life magazine. And Life I chose specifically because John H. Johnson, who founded Ebony magazine, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, modeled it after Life magazine. So his intention was to create kind of the Black version of Life magazine, he said. But you can see here in this advertisement, again, this should make you think of those Own Your Own Home campaign images or Hoover's speech about the home being the center of, family life, right? You have the domestic space in the kitchen. You have the happy children working on their homework. You have, the father who is absent because he's doing the work as a real citizen to provide for them to be in that space, right? But this becomes the place that white American homeowner consumerism holds in kind of the wider American imaginary. I'll show you one other image that's very similar. And you can notice the very kind of same setup, right? The, homemaker and the two kids with their, General Electric freezer. But keep these images in your mind, because what I want to turn to now is then what is happening if you have kind of these parallel things happening where this is the construction of, white American suburbia and the way the nation is framing itself and visualizing itself. And this is the avenue of consumerism and advertisements that are the manifestation of that. What is happening then in terms of Black people and Black space and how they're envisioned in terms of consumerism? So I put up here the title of this this film that John H. Johnson, who is again the founder of Ebony magazine, Jet magazine, a host of others that you may be familiar with, many of us grew up on. He is an extremely important figure in the history of understanding kind of Black consumerism and targeting Black people as consumers. He, in 1954, produced this film in conjunction with the Department of Commerce called The Secret of Selling the Negro. And the film itself is a kind of a walkthrough 101 of like, here's what Black people like to buy, here's what kind of brands they care about, here's how to talk to them. But when I say that he did the work of framing Black people as consumers worthy of white business owners' attention, I really can't understate that. When he founded Ebony magazine in 1945, he first had to do a lot of mail-in orders to survive, but he went door to door, he set meetings, he mailed letters, he, begged these white business owners to start advertising in his magazine. Up until that point, Black people were rarely, if ever, at the center of advertisements or the target of them. So in the kind of top magazines, less than 1% of ads were aimed towards Black Americans. Primarily, we showed up as kind of caricatures in the advertisements. So you think of your, Aunt Jemima and things like that. So what he did to draw this attention, I have to acknowledge the success in that aspect in carving out that kind of discursive space of making the the Black person as a consumer, you know, a recognized figure. There are, of course, you know, issues with that as kind of a, you know, Black liberal project that had unintended consequences, which I'll talk about. But in terms of the success, you know, he was able to do something that others were not. So when he started and drew this attention to what he called the new Negro market, and primarily Ebony became the way to capture that, he increased revenue in kind of these incredible ways. So between 1962 and 1969, Ebony's ad revenue went from 3.6 million to $10 million. So he was wildly successful in achieving what he set out to do with this project. However, I put these images here for a reason, because you'll notice that the types of things that are advertised, you know, create their own set of narratives, right? So this Smirnoff one, I think, is a really good example, because you see a lot of the advertisements focus on the narratives that had been created through, when I mentioned at the beginning, kind of zoning and, you know, those housing policies that coded Black space as morally inferior, as poor, you know, as well as the kind of already existing stereotypes of Black people being, you know, concerned with entertainment or being good at entertainment only. So a lot of the advertisements you see focus on food, liquor, entertainment, clothes, and things like that. I will say, though, you do have an interesting way that the question of homeownership plays out in the ads themselves. And I'll mention that with this Bassett image that you can see on the right. But just so you get a sense of Ebony, in the 50s and 60s, as I went through and looked at all of the issues that were published, they averaged about 185 pages, so these were long, and about 75% were filled with ads. So Ebony in many ways was about advertising. Even though when John Johnson started the magazine, he created it to be about what he called the happier side of Negro life. And it was, and it was really focused on kind of the Black middle class, and you'd have, you know, stories of doctors and lawyers and success. Over time, it was interesting to see the magazine evolve in digging deeper into questions and issues of racism. And I read that quote at the beginning from the 1965 issue that was devoted entirely to this and talked a lot about housing discrimination. But you get these kind of parallel narratives. And I think what's interesting to think of what these advertisements are doing alongside the magazine that on one hand is trying to promote kind of a Black respectability and a worthiness of kind of attention within the project to U.S. capitalism. But on the other hand, in doing that, ends up reinforcing these negative stereotypes of Blackness and Black space. And to give you a sense of the advertisements, you know, Ebony ranked in its kind of stretch 5th in the nation in drug proprietaries, 8th in cigarettes, 10th in liquor, and 16th in cosmetics. And most of those cosmetics, I'll show you a few examples, were about kind of skin whitening and assimilating to European beauty standards. So it's, again, interesting to think of the work that these advertisements are doing alongside what the essays and the magazine are trying to do. But to this image here, what I found with regard to this, you know, very particular question of home ownership and home goods, in Ebony had about, well, I should say Life magazine had about 3 times as many home goods on average as Ebony, right? When I went and looked through and cataloged these. But I think more detail or nuance to understand there is that the majority of the home goods in Ebony magazine were not items tied to homeownership. So you had small appliances, you had, you know, toasters, things like that. Where in Life you had items like flooring, tile, windows, things that were very explicitly visualizing or understanding the white reader as a homeowner consumer, right? And even in this advertisement here, if you look at this image, it's one of the very few images in Ebony magazine that's a home good that features a Black family, right? So presumably you have this mother and daughter here in this beautiful home, and it is a great space. But if you look here at that top left-hand corner, you'll notice that they are in a high-rise apartment, right? So it's interesting that even then in the visualizing of having this Black family, it places them in, you know, the dense urban housing, right? Again, this is not seen as necessarily poor housing at all, but it definitely frames it within the already kind of established understanding of where and how Black people exist and live. What I want to do, and I am being mindful of the time here, is I just want to spend the last few minutes before we get to questions on what I saw happening with Ebony magazine in terms of the implications, arguably unintended, of drawing attention to the Black person as a consumer without necessarily curating or, filtering what that narrative around the Black consumer looks like. And to give you kind of the understanding of where Johnson's mind was at, I'm going to read this quote of how he saw Ebony magazine. So he saw the magazine and the essays, again, I mentioned before, as, about Black, the happier side of Negro life, about Black respectability. But in terms of advertisement, here was his mindset. This is from his autobiography. I held the unofficial position of special ambassador to American whites. Enlightened self-interest, that was my theme. I asked corporate leaders to act not for Blacks, not for civil rights, but for their corporations and for themselves. What it all boiled down to was that equal opportunity was good business. So in many ways for Johnson, it's just about getting the recognition and the placement, right? That Black people are a market that are worth attention, get the ads in there. But then what happens then is that these ads are, of course, shaped by the understanding of Blackness and Black people and the spaces that they live in and the streets themselves. So you get a lot of advertisements that reinforce these stereotypes of Black people as being flashy, overly concerned with clothes and brands. Some of that was even explicitly stated in that film that I talk about, The Secret of Selling the Negro, as well as, a reinforcement of the need for skin whitening creams. And I picked a couple examples that I just found to be particularly, ironic here. So you have, and this is actually from the issue that I read that quote, that's focused on the white problem in America. And you have an essay that's focused on the Black woman and talks about, her successes and the issues and the kind of struggles she faces, including it talks about beauty standards and those issues. It also falls into some of the kind of stereotypical traps of framing her as being, overbearing and some of the things that show up in kind of the Moynihan report. But across in the essay, the pages, on one page you'll have this essay, and then you have this advertisement for this skin whitening cream. And so again, it's interesting to think how you can have the magazine attempting to do one thing, but then the narrative that parallels it is reinforcing these notions of the streets and of Black people and Blackness in America that, in many ways kind of, walk back the attempt that that Johnson is trying to make with this magazine. The next image is from the September 63 issue. And this is one page. So this is a shared page. We have the advertisement here for the hair straightening product. And on the other side, there's this interesting, as part of this series, this essay that is digging into white liberals and the pros and cons of allyship and, the struggles. And again, it's interesting because over time, Ebony really evolves into this complex magazine that is digging into questions of Blackness and the country in nuanced, really analytical ways. But then you have these advertisements that are, again, creating this narrative of the Black consumer that reinforce the very stereotypes and conditions of our lives that they're talking about. The last image that I'll share here is just another example. So you can kind of see the skin whitening cream from the 1965 ad. I just find these advertisements fascinating. But, I think for me in this chapter 2, it's worth looking at, well, the white, after the boom of homeownership and all that ideological work and the policies that make that financially feasible, whiteness gets framed in the lens of media and marketing campaigns as happy domestic family life, right? Where Blackness then is framed as about entertainment, about kind of these, passing trends and fades, about assimilating into society. And And it's really the roots of many of the narratives we begin to see evolve in the 70s and 80s and 90s and get deployed particularly against Black youth, with under Reaganism and, when you get to the super predator narratives, that they're just overly concerned with flashy brand names and clothes and food and entertainment. And that's why the conditions of their lives are the way that they are. So it's interesting to think how an attempt to carve out a discursive space where Black people were overlooked entirely ends up then lending itself to narratives that are used to reinforce and justify the continued kind of segregation and negative aspects of the streets. So I'll maybe end my comments with this. In the rest of the book, I really look at how this plays out in literature, in film and television, and of course I have to talk about hip hop because it was literally created in the streets, but I focus a lot more on this question of how artists and authors are carving out their discursive space, as well as then looking at redress and the conclusion of this is a massive thing, the streets, right? It's economic, it's social, it's cultural. What does it begin to look to redress some of the inequities that stem from this, while also recognizing the community and the good that people have made despite the way that they were fixed in these very specific ways. But I think I will just say, I hope this project lends itself to kind of more intellectual exploration of the streets, but also again, grounding itself in these very material conversations. When I was wrapping the book up, it was the summer of 2020 where we're all, out, some of the uprising, we're protesting. And I really thought about this in the conclusion that, well, it's great that people across the world were noticing this item and protesting the murder of this man, of George Floyd, that this is about the conditions of Black life and not just the conditions of that one death, right? For those of us who live here, the corner that George Floyd was murdered on, which is a couple miles from where I live, if I mention that area, people in here invoke a very specific set of beliefs and associated meanings. And those beliefs, that construct of the streets, is what empowered that officer to take that life. And so for me, the streets, well, they're fascinating to see how they play out and manifest. Again, their understanding has these very kind of clear, tangible outcomes that I think are worth, deeper exploration. So I'll stop there and hopefully we can get into some good discussion. I'll stop sharing my screen too.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. That was really terrific. And there's so many incredibly productive directions that we could go here. And as you mentioned in the closing of your comments, the last 3 chapters are really about literary production, artistic and musical production, and film and television. So there's still a lot that we could get to. I want to encourage everyone in the audience, if you have questions for Dr. Bailey or things that you'd like to explore or contribute to the discussion, please go to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many comments as possible. We've already had a few come in during your presentation, Dr. Bailey. So I will start with one, if you don't mind, that came in. This was during your discussion of the Better Homes movement. And the questioner asks, why were they so intent on creating this defined white middle class? What did the government have to gain from this campaign? Were they just trying to build generational wealth in the white population or promote segregation patterns through residential settlement patterns? Like what ultimately was the aim, and what was the investment of the government of the state in this project? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, that's a tremendous question. So I'll answer it one way, because it's hard to, on one hand, kind of speculate on the hearts and motivations in some regards. But part of why I mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution is because at the time there was a very strong fear that that the white working class was going to ally itself with other working class folks, and particularly of those white ethnic groups that were yet to be kind of fully ushered into mainstream whiteness. And so this project of homeownership and making it ideological desirable, right, to be an accepted member of the nation, as well as then financially feasible, was a way to strengthen and solidify those who had not just kind of sentimental investment in the nation, but also financial investment, right? They are literally purchasing their piece of the land, right? That had been, that had been made a part of this national project. And so I think that that is a large part of the point of this work. Of course, there are other things, I mentioned the fact that a lot of the figures were, had ties to kind of the private sector as well as their work in the government. So there's a lot of financial gain in this as well, right? The people that made these policies possible made, a lot of money off of the construction and the selling of this as well. So, it's a combination of that personal, I think, interest, but I think largely it was about, breaking up that class solidarity in certain ways and ensuring and strengthening the investment in US capitalism when you had a growing threat across. I mean, I think we underestimate it now, but it was seen as a real threat in the early 20th century. And even when we get to that Khrushchev-Nixon moment, it was seen as a threat because communism was appealing, especially if you were poor or working class. And I think we see that in this nation in particular with the way racial capitalism operates, that you see that, the way that whiteness is invoked as a way to give a sense of power where one is disempowered due to class. I think you see this is one of the ways that plays out. That was a great question, though.
Yeah, it was a terrific question. And I think your observation that campaign early on was sponsored first by the National Association of Real Estate Boards is really telling in terms of the financial piece of whiteness as it's constructed as a kind of commodity in this period. Another question gets at the songs in the Herbert Hoover address that you read, and it's a little bit long, but I think it's worth reading to get into the kind of depth of the question. This person writes, "Thanks for your slide on the Herbert Hoover's address. I found it fascinating, especially your mention of songs, Home Sweet Home, My Old Kentucky Home, and so on, as being related to settler colonialist expansion. I wonder if you have looked at the relationship those songs might have with similar types of minstrel songs in the postbellum era. Oh, Susanna, they mentioned, by Stephen Foster." And the questioner is thinking about an essay by Stephanie Dunson called "The Minstrel in the Parlor" that links stereotypes of stock minstrel characters with middle-class white consumerism. So that's a really interesting and rich question. I wonder if you've looked into that or thought about that as you've looked at these various artistic forms.
I wish I could say that I had, but now I'm like, that's a great idea of something to dig into now. I will say, this is one of those things with an interdisciplinary project where you find yourself pulling together so much that there's so much more that I wish I could or can still dig into, where it's really just the beginning of this. So that actually is a great idea. I can see, I can imagine kind of what you're thinking there. And I think there could be some really good connections there. And even connecting that to how we see later performance of that through kind of, Black middle class kind of respectability. There could be some interesting parallels there. But through consumerism, because that becomes an avenue in kind of performing that belonging in many ways later down the line. But yeah, I hadn't. But I will have to write that down as a great suggestion.
It's a neat question. Yeah. I wonder, Dr. Bailey, if you want to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of those kind of discursive sites that you referenced that are opened up by Black artists in this era who are thinking through some of the problems that you've identified, either through literary production, through rap or film and television. And I mean, I would invite you to talk about any of them. I was particularly interested in your comparison in the film and television chapter of David Simon's The Wire and Lena Waithe's The Chi.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you want to talk about that kind of, bounce back and forth and talk about your reading of those two television programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I like, it's interesting that I found when I was writing this and I talked about The Wire. So for those who maybe aren't familiar, which I assumed everyone was, but then I gave a talk with some folks that were a little young to have watched The Wire, and then I felt a little maybe displaced in time myself. But for those who are unfamiliar, so The Wire, I think that he's actually directing a new show I've heard that's I don't know anything about yet. So I'll see how that goes. But The Wire, in terms of cultural phenomenon, had a hold on people. And it was praised, I think it was like a favorite of President Obama, a favorite of many. Is one of the first places that I think American audiences really saw Idris Elba and got to know him as an actor. It's an interesting example of how you see so I'll step back and say, I talk in that chapter about how television and film really become an interesting site of how the streets exist in kind of the contemporary American imaginary, because the void, both physically in space and then kind of, ideologically between white suburban space and Black urban spaces had become so broad that people understood it through what they consumed on film, right? So, especially this becomes a new market for youth, and particularly white youth, to go and see, the hood genre films that are coming out. And of course, hip hop is being consumed in these new ways. And so television becomes another way for people to understand, Black space in a different way. And The Wire was extremely popular because it humanized, I think, these characters in ways that maybe were unprecedented at the time. And so The Wire, if you're unfamiliar, it sets it up so that each season follows a different facet of Baltimore. And so you get, the policing to the school system to journalism. And it's framed as, post 9/11, how the war on terror shifts the funding and the attention away from the war on drugs. And so what does that mean for these spaces, right? So it starts with this group of kind of detectives then trying to figure out how to continue to do their work in the wake of that. It's obviously not centered only on them. So it focuses on, this, drug syndicate and, the locals in these neighborhoods, and it tells their life stories in all these different ways. And it does offer a complex picture of Black people in that space, which is something that I think is why it was so widely enjoyed. I think Stringer Bell, which is Idris Elba's character, is one of the famous examples, as well as, why am I blanking on his character's name?
Oh, Barksdale?
No, I'm thinking of the song. He would sing "A Hunting We Would Go." I'm blanking on the name. He just passed, Michael K. Williams. I can't think of his character's name, but
Omar.
Omar, thank you, Omar. His character as a queer character that is feared and respected by all. And Idris Elba, Stringer Bell, being the business savvy, financially savvy character who just so happens to run a drug syndicate. It did a lot to humanize those characters and those people. But some of my critique is that when you then look at the larger picture of what the story it tells about Black space itself, ultimately it becomes a story of Black space is irredeemable. So while you might have these individuals who are complex and intriguing and humanized, which again, I acknowledge the significance of that, right? It's still ultimately Baltimore, or that part of Baltimore, right? The streets. That Black space at the end of the show is kind of just an irredeemable, corrupt space. And so I think that those are when you look at it through the lens of what does this have to say about, the streets or Black space, you come to a very different conclusion versus what does this have to tell us about, this individual? Because I think the story of the streets is the story of how Black humanity is understood on a wider lens, right? So I talk about that in contrast to the first season of the Chi, which was produced by Lena Waithe. And, now Chicago, particularly South Side, is, again, one of those spaces that invokes very fixed meanings in the American imaginary. I could run into someone, on my block or across the country, and if I say South Side, that invokes a particular set of ideals and images. But what I enjoyed about that show, for the many kind of critiques that were there from people, and I think valid, is that it focused on humanizing the space, right? It focused on the streets as a space that were hosting, community and liberation and joy. And the opening sequence is one I love because it starts with this character, this Black boy who's on his bike, and he's just riding through the city with this like bright smile across his face, right? And so you get this whole sequence that opens it and frames Black space through the lens of his joy, right? In contrast, The Wire opens with a dead body and the police, lights and sirens. And so it opens by framing Black space as one of violence and crime and corruption. And so I think that, these are things we might not necessarily notice, but I in that work want us to really interrogate not just kind of characters and how they're developed, but like how on screen are we reinforcing ideas and notions of these spaces themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And again, these have tangible consequences because in political discourse today, we know what it means to reference the violence in Chicago. We know what it means to reference the fearful suburban mom, right? So these things have these tangible consequences, and they're being, reified in these, very, I think, under reflected upon ways. But yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I wonder if I could build on that, your reading of The Chi in contrast to The Wire, and it makes me think of a little bit of the James Baldwin quote from The Fire Next Time, which you include in that, I think chapter 3. Mm-hmm. You quote him writing, "I was icily determined never to make my peace with the ghetto," which you read beautifully as a kind of his insistence on resisting the kind of spatial isolation and that white society has imposed, and the kind of moral devaluation of his life that comes with that. It's a kind of his resistance to the moral dimensions of anti-Black racism. In your bigger analysis of the literary musical works, there's this constant dialogue that I found really interesting between escape and reclamation, or maybe between, if you take Baldwin, maybe defiance, escape, and reclamation. And that's just a really interesting theme through all of your readings. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any of those, or maybe the relationship among them. The ghetto is a space to be, the streets are a space to be resisted, but also reclaimed, escaped, but also reclaimed. And I wonder if you could sort of think through that for the audience.
Yeah, and sorry, I had to mute myself. I think the mail person just came and my dog is not enjoying that. So yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up. I think it's a common through line that I saw both in literature, and then I apologize if you can hear that, in literature as well as in the films, particularly when we get to the hood genre films of the 90s, right? And I think literature tended to move beyond that a little quicker, but than film and television. Right. But it's interesting because, I think the first reaction that you see often is, even amongst these Black artists, writers, creatives, is to collapse the meaning of the streets and to see, escape is the way, right? And you see that in, so one of the novels I talk about, which is my absolute favorites, is The Street by Ann Petrie. And the main character, that's her purpose. Like, she's going to get this good job. She's going to find a way to move out with her son. She's going to move up and out of this, right? The novel is kind of tragic, and that's not what happens. But you see the understanding of the streets evolve to be, there's the streets or the ghetto as the construct that has been imposed upon Black people. And then there's the discursive space, the imagined geography within that, of what Black people have made that space to be, right? And so that's where I see, it's like you resist this construct finding the hope and the joy and the claiming of this space that you have carved out within, that isn't exclusive or separate from the streets, right? And to me, that's, I mean, kind of one of the key arguments I make is that that's what we should be aiming for, because it's more complex than, you know, just get rid of it, or this is how, you know, like it acknowledges the work that Black people have done to create those imagined geographies within it, right? I think you see that with James Baldwin. I think you see that particularly when we get to kind of hip hop and the way that that as a genre was used to do that, even in the kind of, you know, post-golden phase where people are like, oh no, where you have people saying, you know, yes, we're going to talk about this, but also there's this joy in this community. It's not an either or, right? Or when you get to, you know, films like Moonlight, where you have the drug dealer who is also the tenderhearted like caregiver, right? Like it's not an either or, it's the claiming of this space while resisting these conditions that try to fix you in this particular way.
Right, right. In that regard, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about your reading of rap, which was terrific, and you start by, or at one point you cite my colleague and the center director Tricia Rose. I don't want to start a fight, but you cite Professor Rose declaiming that white executives had essentially taken this form which had this powerful liberatory potential and essentially turned it into a site of predatory capitalism. And my reading of your reading is that you're a little bit more ambivalent about what that looks like. And I wonder if you could just maybe talk through for the audience a little bit of, you know, how you're kind of reading that dimension of the, as you said, the kind of post-golden age and the rise of gangster rap and the you know, the descent of white studio executives or music executives into this genre. And
yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting and an important discussion. And I love her work, and I cited her and enjoy it. And I also, you know, admittedly, I think like most generations, like the line after ours, I'm like today's rap, I'm like, oh, this mumble rap. But I know that's my personal taste and opinion. But, you know, intellectually, when I pause and look at it, I think it's, again, coming back to that, how do I look at this as a both and, right? Like we can clearly mark that there was a shift, right? That you get to that when hip hop becomes popularized and consumed along, and it's again the same trajectory as those hood genre films, where you have people attempting to show themselves and things in a wider light, like John Singleton's work, but the way it was consumed and interpreted and understood sent it on these different trajectories, right? And again, primarily consumed by, you know, young white teenagers and youth, and then executives who saw that as a, you know, lucrative market who jumped into that, right? But for me, I think you can recognize that while also looking at, you know, where it's easier to look at kind of conscious hip hop or so-called conscious hip hop and say, like, here are these very clear critiques of, you know, the structure of, you know, the ghetto or the streets that we just talked about. You might not have that in like gangster rap or what happens later, but you still have that other piece, which is carving out a discursive space that humanizes and offers joy. And something I'm particularly interested in digging into that chapter is the performance of power as a way to challenge white supremacy, right? So it might not be the performance we like, but it's something Ta-Nehisi Coates talks a little bit about. But to me, I see this as not far removed from the Black Panthers and the way that they would carry their guns and their jacket. It was about the performance of power, right? It was about performing the fact that I have the power to protect and secure myself on my own. And we might see that as hubris and these other things, but the performance of power and to run, you know, these streets or to own this block is an attempt to claim, right, that sovereignty and that ownership that's been denied. And so we have to acknowledge the problematic aspects, the sexism, the homophobia, those things. We also, I think, have to recognize there is something compelling as an art form, right? The performance of power, the claiming of one's own self or one's own space, and the demanding of the right to just be a complex human, right? I talk a little bit about Kendrick Lamar's work, and I like that there's just this narrative of Black youth and humanity. It's just like, I'm just a human. and that's a claim that, might not seem like much at face value, but when you have this construct and what happens in the 80s and the 90s where it says, no, you're a super predator, you're not a human, that when you put gangster rap alongside of that, that claiming of selfhood, of ownership of power becomes, I think, more meaningful.
Yeah, that's interesting. The performance of power is a really interesting phrase. I think you use guerrilla theater in the book too, if I'm remembering right. Yeah, and I wonder too then about the masculinist piece of that, and in an era, thinking about sort of the kind of arc of the book, where Moynihan in a way is kind of in the middle. And so you look at developments that sort of predate him, and then you look at developments subsequently. And I'm thinking in particular of, whether Ann Petrie's novel or The Shy or artistic works that center women offer, a different way of performing power or a different relationship to that reclamation project. Do you think they're the same, or is there a way to think about a line of, a gender line through all of the kinds of artistic and cultural works that you examine?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one I wrestled with, and I think that's a broader theme in kind of, anyone doing this kind of work, is that on one hand, I see a lot of Black women, artists, thinkers, creatives, framing and focusing on, like even Lena Waithe's project with The Shy, focusing on, the centering of this, Black man, boy youth, right? And seeing that same thing with Ann Petrie, where the protagonist is Ludi, this mother, but her struggle is about her son, right? And him not succumbing to the streets. And I think on one hand, that's a recognition of the gendered way that the streets have played out and the targeting of young Black men. But you still see the within those often the themes and the issues where Black women are asserting their own kind of struggles are often internal. So in the street, Ann Petrie deals a lot with the threats of her superintendent and her boyfriend and these Black men who have been disempowered by the structures of the space and the segregation that they're facing, who then turn that around to disempower her through, sexual harassment and abuse and things like that. And spoiler, sorry if you're for the book, but it ends with her murdering someone because of, an attempt for gendered violence, right? And so, but that becomes the framing of, like, for her, it's about, this is the culmination of the violence of the streets. And it's in this very gendered way of how it plays out for her. Right. And I wish I had, dug more into this in the book, in the hip hop section, but in a lot of, Black women MCs and artists, the focus is again on these themes of Black men in the community and those things. Right. So yeah, I think
sorry. Yeah,
no, please.
I didn't think about this in this exact way when I was reading the book, but now that I hear you kind of answer that question, and it makes me think that the reclamation of parenthood to some degree, and maybe it's gendered, but it's also, because I think about Boys in the Hood, which is about a father, but it's also about a reclamation of a kind of respectability politics of the family, and him reclaiming fatherhood on the screen. Yeah, which is, you think about the line from Ann Petrie and the mother in that story. So that, again, I didn't think about that, but that's an interesting thematic, and I would like to go back and look at your readings and think of with that kind of in mind. But on that question of gender and the kind of effect of the streets on men. The other kind of interesting theme I thought in your readings, and this really came from right at the beginning when you analyze Ann Petrie's The Street, you argue that it raises a central question here, and I'm going to quote you: "Can individualism overcome the street?" And that's a powerful question, because in the previous chapter, you've been so careful about showing how individualism within kind of the white imaginary, individualism and homeownership and Americanism all get so tightly linked together. And then you raise this question kind of for Black cultural spaces, is individualism going to do it? So I was really, that just set my mind thinking as I read your other interrogations of Black art, of this tension between individualism and mutuality, and between individualism and community, between, and maybe it's partly related to that escape versus reclamation, but
yes,
just
exactly.
that tension between I'm going to do it, I'm going to make it, versus there's a kind of community that is also part of the production of me, that seems in some ways really counter to the way that the white imaginary seems to be working in the same period. Anyway, and not to put words in your mouth, but I wonder if you could just think through your own thought, how your thought about that relationship.
Yeah, and I would say even with the way it's framed for, kind of white homeownership through this individual family, it uses that language, but in service of a communal, national project, right? So that in term, that kind of loose term of community, right? So even that is, in service of this greater thing. But I'm glad you brought up the escape, versus kind of resistance or change, because I think that really becomes the dilemma, right? And one of the reasons I love, The Street as a novel is because I think the novel itself shows here's what happens when your focus is on individual escape. I mean, it's a pretty, kind of damning picture of it. It's very clear that the novel is showing us that you cannot escape the streets individually. But I think even if you look at, a lot of the hood genre films were about the individual making it, right? But they also would show the people and the lives and the community that are left behind. And I think it shows where someone might escape the streets. That's not, you're escaping the physical space, but going back to this idea of the fact that the streets will continue to shape as a construct, a social cultural construct, Blackness and your life and belonging in this nation, regardless of where you physically reside. So, and I think that's something James Baldwin and Coates kind of reflect on as they talk about their own movement in kind of these white spaces and how they were still shaped or perceived. But yeah, it's one of those things of you might physically escape, but even that individualism is limited because the streets as an entity will follow you and shape how you are perceived and seen and how you're meant to be.
All right, that's interesting. And you start in a way with your own personal story. You frame that as from the beginning. Yeah. Well, so speaking of that, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about, if you want, about the conclusion. And I'm really, and again, this is not something that I immediately registered when I read the book, but now in hearing your talk, I mean, you start with Herbert Hoover and you end with Kimberly Crenshaw. And that's a pretty amazing kind of arc. Right. So you start with the construction of a particular kind of commodified whiteness, and you end with Kimberly Crenshaw with a kind of lament that any reclamation or redress or reparation sort of involves unclenching white investment in that commodification. And I mean, I know you wanted to have a very hopeful and optimistic piece to this too. So I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about that, that ending and how you think about, the kind of delivering the final body blow of the book.
Yeah. I am, notoriously bad, probably like many researchers and writers, at that optimistic piece. And I find when I give these talks, especially to kind of community or public groups, there's more of a desire for that. And I feel slightly bad, but I think it's important that we look at it in its complexity. Right. And so for me, on one hand, obviously I'm someone who grounds things in materialism. And I think that, if you talk about this construct of the streets or the ghetto in terms of that, you have to have conversations about reparations and not just, broadly, but, economic, policy wise, like a lot of different structural things will have to be done. And I talk about that because frankly, we're looking at a huge, disparity there, but that's kind of a pocket conversation in the fact that the streets are not just the economic disparity between white and Black people, right? It's about the placing of ideologically, Blackness in this country and the investment in home ownership and land ownership. And really, that's what it takes for redress is like, as you mentioned, how do we, Crenshaw's wonderful kind of writing and quote there about, how do we divest from that? Because that's really the only means of redress. And you can't have those economic conversations until you do that ideological work of undoing, right? And part of why I frame this in kind of this national understanding of the project of the US and settler colonialism is acknowledging the fact that, my answer to this is not just give Black people houses, because that's not going to solve all these other pieces of, a country, right, in this kind of convoluted kind of project of not our land, right? But I think that the beginning place has to be, again, a divestment from that particular understanding of the nation to imagine something better where there is, the economic and the structural pieces, but also the space, those imagined geographies to expand and to grow in ways that are led by those people. And that is a conversation tangibly when I have with folks. I say, this is where I say you have to start on those local levels, because communities have spent decades or almost nearly a century, right, carving out what their space means. I have some local neighborhoods here where that's the case. And so the solution isn't just to come up with some policy or some economic movement that just undoes everything they've built on top of it, because the streets are now,
right,
what they've carved out, as well as the space of these poverties, existing in these same physical planes. And so I think that it has to be led from those folks in those communities.
That's really powerful and fascinating. And it must be amazing to sort of be able to give this kind of presentation outside of the academy and feel the community input and feel the kind of get the sense of the community investment in what you're talking about and how you're framing it. This has been incredibly interesting, and I am so grateful to you, Dr. Bailey, and thank you to the CSREA for making this possible. Thank you to the audience for your great attention and great questions. I had a really wonderful time, and I really want to thank you, Dr. Bailey.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being a great moderator. This is a wonderful conversation, so thank you all so much.
My pleasure.